man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people.
It's my honor to be here tonight, and I got to know Governor McKeithen as a man and as a character when he was a member of the LSU Board of Supervisors. In 1964, when he took office, I was 6 years old, so I knew him as a historical figure, and certainly he lived up to everything I'd ever imagined about him. He was born May the 28th, 1918, and died on June 4th, 1999, not too far from here. And in those 81 years, he was more than a witness to history. He was a participant in history, from the Great Depression to World War II to the Civil Rights Movement to Vietnam, and of course to Louisiana as we know it today. Many of the seeds were planted during his 8 years as governor, and he was the first two-term governor consecutively in the 20th century. And we've got four gentlemen here who knew him in different ways, and each has a story to tell about their association with Governor McKeithen and about his impact on our state. And what I'd like to do is I'll introduce each one of them, and we'll start with Dan Borné and get his take, first of all, on how he met Governor McKeithen and what he thinks Governor McKeithen meant to the state of Louisiana. Dan, in addition to being the voice of Death Valley, and he's started his 30th year last Saturday and had 4 minutes and 50-some seconds before.
29 years and 5 minutes, Jim. So there you go.
So, but he'll be back for many more years, perhaps 30 more. He's president of the Louisiana Chemical Association, representing the interests of 66 chemical manufacturing companies that operate at over 90 locations in the state. Also president of the Louisiana Chemical Industry Alliance, and he is a man who's been a journalist and of course is involved in various aspects of our state. He's a graduate of both Nicholls State and LSU, a member of the Manship School Hall of Fame, and he is a man who knows Governor McKeithen from many years ago. And Dan's not too much older than I, so when Governor McKeithen was elected, I guess Dan would have been about 18 years old. But he got to know him pretty well. And let's start with you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think that might be my cue to play a song. We dredged up from the old Borné library here. Let's see if this works, okay? This is Governor McKeithen's campaign song during his re-election year. And it was written by a guy named Leroy Martin from Lafourche Parish. So let's see if it works, okay? I hope it does. Ted broke it. I'm kidding. Boy, this technology is great. All right, connected. And
let's give him another victory. Louisiana needs Big John back in.
all right, I think we got it. Let's try it. If my grandchild was here, it would work. We'll work on it later, okay? It may just break in just a moment. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it was just a delight driving up to Columbia from Baton Rouge. It brought back so many memories. I had a political life interspersed between being the PA guy at Tiger Stadium and getting to know Governor McKeithen as a newsman back in 1968 when I first went to work for a CBS affiliate in Baton Rouge. I subsequently worked for Senator Allen Ellender and Senator Russell Long and Senator Elaine Edwards, who was appointed, by the way, to take Senator Ellender's place after he died, and then worked for Governor Edwin Edwards during his first and second terms. And so, although I knew the governor Weill, from a news coverage point of view, he was a tremendously easy person to deal with as a media person. Gregarious, entertaining, told great stories, always available, brought people into the kitchen of the mansion, entertained them. He was delightful. The thing I learned about Governor McKeithen from Senator Russell Long, though, has left a lasting impression on me in terms of his commitment to and his contribution to growing jobs in Louisiana. Senator Long told me that Governor McKeithen, freshly elected, spoke with him and said that he had the third or fourth best economic inducement package in the country, and that he was going to go around and try to get companies to put plants in Louisiana. And Senator Long said, John, and they had been old friends, he said, John, why are you bragging about the third or fourth? Why don't you have the first? And so Governor McKeithen came back and had the legislature enact something called the Right to Profit laws. And the Right to Profit laws consisted of a package of incentives to bring companies to Louisiana. We had tremendous resources here. We had oil and natural gas. We had a manufacturing legacy that came out of World War II. We had contributed significantly to the Allied victory in World War II, a victory that the governor contributed to, earning 2 Bronze Stars. So we had land, we had people, we had the aorta of American commerce, the Mississippi River, we had the Calcasieu Basin. And Governor McKeithen took the Right to Profit laws, and he went around the country and he went around the world meeting with the titans of industry, inviting them to come to Louisiana. Now, we are experiencing a renaissance in our petrochemical industry, all up and down the river and in Lake Charles. $20 billion coming out of the ground, another $20 billion in the queue. Governor McKeithen's contribution during the 60s and in the early 70s, because of all of the rollout of these laws that he had passed, in those dollars might not be 20 billion, but they are so significant that you have to give him credit for the first renaissance in in Louisiana manufacturing history. I'll give you an idea how many companies came to Louisiana because of Governor McKeithen. I have about 40 of them on a list here who either came to Louisiana to invest for the first time, or who significantly raised the amount of investment that they had in the state, all up and down the river and in southwest Louisiana. And they just weren't American companies. Governor McKeithen went to Europe, he went to the Far East, he laid out what Louisiana had to offer, he laid out the resources, he laid out the land, he laid out the productive workforce that was available, and he, through personal charisma, induced companies to come to Louisiana. BASF came to Louisiana under Governor McKeithen's watch from Germany. ICI came to Louisiana from England and from Belgium. Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, came to Louisiana to build chemical plants. Copolymer came to Louisiana from the Netherlands. Air Liquide came to Louisiana from France. Governor McKeithen went out and he picked these companies. He sold Louisiana to them, and they have come to Louisiana and they're still here. And so Governor Jindal has recognized this, and on several occasions when he's cut ribbons to welcome new investment into Louisiana, he has said that this is the greatest wave of investment since Governor John McKeithen. And so even our governor to this day, Bobby Jindal, under his watch, a lot of companies are spending big money in Louisiana. He recognizes the contribution that Governor McKeithen made to growing Louisiana's workforce. Also, having worked for Ellender and Long and Edwards, I got an inside look of some of the history of Governor McKeithen and some of the other offices that he considered running for at one time. At one time, he thought about running against Ellender in 1966, and said to one close advisor that if the two-term amendment had not passed, that he would probably run against Senator Ellender in that 1966 campaign. He also seriously considered, according to Russell Long, running against Russell Long in 1968. And it was an incredible series of events that led to Senator Humphrey, the nominee, entertaining the thought of putting Governor McKeithen on the ticket as vice presidential candidate. That took Governor McKeithen's interest away from running in 1968 against Russell Long and put him in the national spotlight. That didn't work out. But he also ran for the U.S. Senate in 1972 when Senator Ellender died in the middle of a primary, and Bennett Johnston was the Democrat at the time. The governor was interested in entering that race as a Democrat. And Governor Edwards at the time had committed to Bennett Johnston that he would support Bennett in the Senate race in the event that Ellender did not finish the race. And it was during that period that the State Central Committee did not reopen qualifications to permit Governor McKeithen to run as a Democrat. And so he subsequently ran for the United States Senate as an independent, was unsuccessful. And so my overall impression of him was that he loved this state, he loved this country, he had a particular passion for ethics in government. Edwin Edwards, as a rookie state senator, sponsored the ethics bill for Governor McKeithen in the Senate, and also sponsored a bill that McKeithen was adamant about, and that is the investment of idle funds. The state had money in banks. It was not garnering interest or any investment income, and Governor McKeithen put the law on the books to make sure that that money got invested and reinvested so that the state could get money off of its own money. So my final impression of him is that he will go down as a great governor, the history book of which has not been written yet. There's really no outstanding, strong biography of Governor McKeithen. And I think that's work that needs to be done. And I challenge authors who have an interest in politics and in the political history of his state to spend a couple of years researching the life and the times of this man and putting it into a book so that every Louisianian after us will have the opportunity to understand the contribution that he made. Thank you.
Dan. Next, we have Dr. Jerry Sanson. 29 years he's been a professor of history and political science at LSU Alexandria. He was reared not too far from here, and like many of us who are from Louisiana, he knew Governor McKeithen as a historical figure, and I imagine somewhere along the way your paths crossed.
Actually, they didn't. I must be the only member of this panel who never met him. But because historians pretend to have some degree of objectivity, that might be a good thing. But nevertheless, I teach Louisiana history every semester. And I have actually for more than 29 years. I also spent 2 years at LSU at Eunice. And then I also taught part-time for the LSU history department when I was in graduate school. So I've talked about John McKeithen for a long time. And the main point that I always try to leave with my students about Governor McKeithen was that he invented the way that we run for governor these days. That the 1960 election was important because, for one thing, it was the last one that Earl Long participated in, not as a candidate for governor, but at least he was around for that election and tried to influence it, and then died a few months later, the same year. But that election showed that bifactionalism was mortally wounded, if not already dead. But would it come back? Was there somebody on each side, the Longite and the anti-Longite side, to pick up the torches and resurrect it for the 1964 campaign? And of course, John McKeithen proved that no, we've moved beyond that. McKeithen, of course, very famously in that campaign, put together a coalition of voters who wanted to vote for John McKeithen. Not necessarily because he'd been Longite or anti-Longite. Those factions really didn't matter much anymore, if anything. And then he put together his own coalition. And then, once he obtained the Democratic nomination, he also faced another hurdle, and that was Charlton Lyons' campaign. Lyons, Republican oil man from Shreveport, received about 35% of the vote or so in the general election that year. Certainly not enough to win, but it was a wake-up call for many people who had, well, to use the vernacular, had been meeting in the phone book for the Republican convention, in the phone booth for the Republican conventions. Yet he proved that there were a number of people who would vote Republican in Louisiana. Well, if you have the beginnings of a revival of a two-party system, bifactionalism doesn't have a place in Louisiana politics anymore. So McKeithen was part of that transition, a major part of that transition, and he helped to make that transition. And then, of course, once he was inaugurated as governor, he was a different sort of Southern governor from the run-of-the-mill Southern governor in the mid and late 1960s. These were the same years, after all, when some of the other states experienced some very, very difficult, violent, even deadly in some cases, racial incidents that Louisiana, by and large, didn't have. And it was John McKeithen's role to help defuse some of those things in Louisiana. And of course, we could say some other things. Certainly, he was a pioneer in helping to bring industries into Louisiana. In my part of the state, central Louisiana, a lot of people recognized the Garan industry buildings with John McKeithen, as well as some of the others that located in other parts of the state. So all of that is a legacy, Superdome legacy, that was also a part of his political acumen here that he had and exercised here in Louisiana. So was he one of the great governors of Louisiana? I've always thought so. He was one who took Louisiana and moved it forward. Right? Some governors preside, some govern, and I think he governed.
Thank you,
Thank
Chairman.
you.
Next is, okay, all right, we'll go to Gus Weill, who not only was a close associate of Governor John McKeithen, but may have been his closest friend. He is appropriately recognized as the father of modern public relations in Louisiana. He started in 1958 doing political consulting when it was in its infancy in this state and in this country, and one of his first clients was a guy named John Kennedy. And a few years later, he meets the man from Columbia, John McKeithen, and as they say, the rest is history, and they had a friendship that continued for another 36 years. Gus Weill.
Thank you, Jim. Brother Nash, ladies and gentlemen, I'll start with an admittance. Can you all hear me? Tonight, I rode here with Mr. Engster, and when we passed that John McKeithen bridge over that river, I had to put my hand to my neck or I'd have burst out crying. Not a day has gone by, not a day, that I do not mourn and miss John Julian McKeithen. The first time I met him was in the summer of 1963. He came looking for somebody to handle his campaign, and he hired me. We'd never seen each other. After he left, I went to my old mother and father's, and they said, well, how did you like him? I said, well, I'll tell you the truth. I feel like I just spent a couple of hours with Abraham Lincoln. I knew that from the moment that I went to work for him, that I would study at his feet. I was a student, and I wanted to learn all of the magic that John McKeithen had. How he could talk himself into the governor's office from this rural part of the state is inconceivable. With very little money, with the vote divided between conservatives who didn't trust him and liberals who sure didn't trust him, and win is unbelievable. When I saw Brother Nash, I thought of one little story. When McKeithen had been in office a while, he had brought so much industry into Louisiana that he acquired for the state a Lear jet. And we flew to Tioga, he and I. And the jet landed in a little airstrip in Tioga and missed running into a embankment by about 2 inches. And John McKeithen was enraged. And he cursed up a storm. He invented new curse words that I never heard. And haven't heard them since. So we get off the plane, and standing there, Brother Nash, on the board, the Pentecostal Church of Louisiana.
The superintendent of the weeks was my 5th cousin through the Nashes, and so was Rebel Ryle. He was getting all of them.
And they looked at McKeithen, and he, without batting an eye, he said, "Gentlemen, you'll have to forgive my young friend here. He loses his temper and cusses terrible." For the balance of the meeting, they all shunned me. What did John McKeithen do? He brought more industry to Louisiana. That means jobs, tax money, shoppers. He brought more industry to Louisiana than had ever been brought before and will ever be brought since. The current governor could not shine John McKeithen's shoes. I'm 83, so I kind of call it like I see it now. You know? The humbug, the clock is ticking, and the humbug is in the left and right. He saved the city of New Orleans with the Superdome. He saved that city. The Final Four, the Super Bowl, everything, political conventions. He saved New Orleans, Louisiana. I told him, "Governor, please don't do that. Don't do that. Don't spend that $150 million in New Orleans. The voters of North Louisiana will never forgive you for that." And they didn't. And he, of course, was defeated for the Senate. He ended Longism for all times in Louisiana. The Longs were the dynasty who built this state. Huey Long, I think, was a great man who gave free school books and free lunches. And John McKeithen had been a Long man. He'd been Earl Long's floor leader. He'd run for lieutenant governor with Judge Spate, got beat. And the word was that Russell Long was going to endorse him for governor. And they have that Mardi Gras ball in Washington. And a fellow told McKeithen at that ball, Russell Long had not only not endorsed him, but endorsed a distant cousin named Gillis W. Long. The rug was pulled right from under him. The conservatives didn't trust McKeithen. They were for Judge Bob Cannon.
Right.
They were for Shelby Jackson.
Right.
The liberals were divided between Shep Morrison, the great mayor of New Orleans, and Gillis W. Long. And somewhere in the middle, God knows what he was. I never knew if he was a liberal or a Democrat or what. Somewhere in the middle was John J. McKeithen, and he talked his way into the governor's mansion and talked the state into changing the Constitution so he could run again, and talked the state into re-electing him governor. And I want to tell you all, he loved Columbia and Caldwell Parish. Now, if anybody thinks he ever forgot y'all, they're crazy as can be. This was always the middle and the most important part of his life. There was a very prominent man, I won't name him, he's deceased now, from Columbia. And McKeithen had just been elected. The man had not supported him. And word came to McKeithen that that man was going to write some articles against him in the Caldwell Watchman. McKeithen said, "We'll cure that." And you pointed the man to some big job. And from then on, all the news out of Caldwell was good news.
Real good.
McKeithen was what you would call a practical man. And I just, as I say, I came here to deliver his eulogy. And even in heaven, he played a trick on me. I want to tell you what it was. He had bought, after he left the governor's office, a beautiful white suit like a southern planter. And he and I talked about that suit almost every day. He said, I'm going to leave you that suit so you look prominent. I said, well, I appreciate it. And I get to the funeral, and I'll walk over to his casket, and there's John McKeithen in my suit.
That's great.
I thought he's honored me by naming me to give his eulogy. But I followed Reverend T.J. Jemison, an African American from Baton Rouge, who also gave the eulogy. So McKeithen was playing jokes on me all the time, every minute. I want to tell you, men like him come along so seldom. How this red clay, how this soil, how these piney woods produced this man will always be a mystery. Is there another one among you? I don't know. In my lifetime, there's been one John Julian McKeithen, and not a day goes by that I don't thank the Almighty God that I got to know him and to serve him. I thank you.
Before we get to Ted Jones, Governor McKeithen was a great orator, and obviously Gus is not far behind. But there was a time when the governor was on his way to New Orleans, and like Gus, I can tell you, I wrote up here with Gus, this is all extemporaneous. The governor ends up having to give a speech on a subject that he was unprepared for, and he goes to Gus. And I think it's worth a mention here as to how this worked out. You recall that?
We went to the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans. He had to give a speech to the financial community, the bigwigs. We piled in that LA1, that big old limo, and we got to New Orleans, and I sat in the back of the auditorium, and he sat at the head table, and he did this. Come see. And I went there, I said, yes, sir. He said, what do you know about the Battle of New Orleans? I said, not a damn thing. He said, me neither. He said, and that's what they expect me to talk about. And look who's sitting at the end of the table. Russell Long, a competitor. So I borrowed a menu, and I borrowed a pencil. I was never prepared. And I wrote him some rather beautiful remarks about the Battle of New Orleans, about which I knew nothing. And he gave that speech, and he got a standing ovation. And he told me, I will never let you out of my eyesight again. I want you handed. That is a true story.
Ted Jones is a prominent attorney who's been counsel to governors, members of Congress, U.S. senators, and presidential candidates, the author of 2 books on business and tax planning. He served as chief of staff to Speedy Long, former congressman, counsel for Medicare for Governor John McKeithen, special counsel for Governor Edwards, and on the presidential campaign staff for Vice President Hubert Humphrey, graduate of LSU, class of 1940. Ted Jones, tell us about your experience with Governor McKeithen.
Well, I kind of came on as kind of a second-handed guy. Gus brought me down. I was running Speedy Long's office in Washington, and Gus talked me into coming down to work for the governor. Of course, I had known Governor McKeithen since 1952. When he ran for the Public Service Commission. I was out driving one of them sound trucks that that Governor Earl Long had for Governor McKeithen in the Public Service Commission race. So I knew the governor, but I was just kind of a young guy, and you know, they always kind of stick with the guys that know everything around politics. So I was just a street hand, and I put on bumper stickers and passed out cards and all that kind of stuff, and told them what I knew from time to time if they wanted to hear it. But Governor McKeithen was a different guy from most people that you will ever meet. His administration was a model for state government in the modern age. He was a visionary. He was extremely bright. He was a perceptive and skilled trial lawyer. I tried 2 cases against him, and I never won the first case against him. He never prepared, but he walked in that courtroom and waited for me to make a mistake, and he beat me to death with it. But he was also an ordained minister by a group out of New Orleans. He gave me the Bible that they sent him, and it's written in the Bible. I still have that. And he had a country boy persona. He was a country guy. And he had a flat-footed speaking style. He just commanded your attention when he spoke. I call it the preacher complex. And he was very persuasive, and when it came across to you, it was genuine. And when he met Gus Weill, he met a guy who could match his brilliance with words, because Gus had as much brilliance as John McKeithen. And let me tell you, when you saw those 2 guys rattling around, the best thing to do was stay out of the way, because something good was going to come out of it. He loved Gus more than anybody, in my opinion, except his family. And Gus performed for him through the years, and he put him in the position to talk to industry in a way that they had never been talked to at the CEO level. He went into those boardrooms, and let me tell you something, just a country guy from Caldwell Parish, he took those guys totally over. He wanted a clean administration, because John's mind, he was clean. He didn't associate with bad people. He went to church. He raised his family to go to church. And any suggestion that he condoned corruption or bad government was totally wrong.
You're right.
He never associated with bad characters. And it pained him deeply for people to accuse him of things that was unreasonable for a man of his stature and what he had been through. But what did he really accomplish? He was one of the few lawyers that made $100,000 a year in 1960. He was an excellent trial lawyer, but he had no real wealth. But when he left the governor's office, he could have gone with any major law firm in this country and made millions. But he would not sell the trust of the people of Louisiana. They had entrusted him, the first governor with 2 terms in modern history, successive terms, and he wouldn't let them have that. It reminded me of what Harry Truman said. Truman was asked to join boards and stuff like that when he left the presidency, and he's told them, no, you don't want me, you want the presidency, and it's not for sale. And John McKeithen looked at the governor's office in the same way. He came home to Columbia, and he knocked around his law office for the rest of his life. And that was what he wanted. But in his campaign, and Gus can tell you this, his campaign spoke of ethics to come. And I heard a lot of old-line politicians said, I don't quite believe John knows what he's talking about. He's talking about all that good government stuff. He knew exactly what he was talking about. And when he became governor, he implemented some of the proposals of the good government organizations, PAR and Cable, and some of the things that they had advocated through the years that the last governor that would even look at it was Governor Kennan. But John McKeithen took a look at it. Let me get over here and see if I can turn the page. he ordered the first state code of ethics, which in part I helped to draft. And Judge Spate got all the credit for drafting and presenting but Sidney Fazio and I really did the ethics code. But there's not anything in it I recognize today. It's just been blown totally out of proportion. And then he put in a trust code so people could take some of what they had earned during their life and put it in trust for their children or whatever they wanted to do with it. But the state had no trust code because it was contrary to the civilian theories of the law in this state. All other states had trust, but not Louisiana until John McKeithen put it in. He made every effort to avoid racial conflict in this state. At a time when the Civil Rights Bill had been signed in 1964 by President Johnson, John McKeithen took that to heart. But he was not a guy that would mistreat people. He might razz you a little bit. I mean, he'd see me sometime. He said, "Ted, how many wives you got?" He had a way of razzing you. But he would never let somebody be mistreated because of their color or where they came from or what they were about. He thought that if you let racial conflict, which broke out in Mississippi and Alabama and other states, Georgia with Lester Maddox and all that, he thought that would hurt the state's ability to attract industrial corporations to come to the state and provide jobs. And he was not going to let it happen. He set up a group that we call the Racial Commission on Human Rights and Responsibilities. And he hired the first black lawyer that ever worked for the governor of the state, outside of A.B. Pinchback, excuse me. But Jesse Stone was the first black lawyer to work for the state and be on the state's payroll in the governor's office. I ran the governor's office in terms of the administration, which Gus put me in charge of that. And the governor told me, he said, "I want you to hire a black secretary." And I did. I hired Dr. Felton Clark's secretary from Southern University to come in and work for me in the governor's office. So John McKeithen never mistreated people. He kept peace. When George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door, John McKeithen encouraged peace and brotherly love and get along and let's move forward. We've got to work through this. And we did. He brought the first fresh economic development to this state that came from since the time we discovered oil in Louisiana. He brought the chemical industry. And this is what he did. He wanted to attract industry to come down. So he went out and hired some head power that could help come up with some ideas on what industry would really follow. And what he learned was that major corporations have a credit rating on their debentures. So he hired Bill Hackett from Mississippi. And Bill came in and we set up the right to profit laws. Now here's the way he would do it when he went to Pittsburgh, let's say, and met with some chemical company, or went to Michigan and met with Dow Chemical. He said, "Look, guys, the state will issue revenue bonds. And we'll support those bonds with a lease from you for the plant that we're going to build for you. But we'll build it to your specifications. You hire the contractor, you develop the plans, we'll issue the revenue bonds and stand on your credit. And when you pay off the bonds, we'll give you the title to the property for $1. Then he also promised them cheap natural gas. Natural gas was selling at that time for 18 cents a thousand cubic feet. So what he said is, we have water transportation on the Mississippi River, and we have cheap power, which goes to your bottom line. And that's what they bought, the ability to finance, the ability to provide the resources they needed was fuel for their bottom line. They could make more money by coming to Louisiana. And John McKeithen figured that out, how to do it and how to make that pitch.
Can you hold off, because we're getting close to 7 o'clock here, and I'd like to get a few comments from our panel, and
All right.
I'll give you an opportunity to finish up.
All right.
But Governor McKeithen, when he was elected, as we know, he was a North Louisiana Protestant, a Democrat. Today, we're 44 days away from gubernatorial primary, and all the major candidates are from the I-10 corridor, from South Louisiana. 3 are Catholic, 1 is Jewish, 3 are Republican, 1 is Democrat. Let's start with Dan Borné, and we'll move along. Do you think, Dan, John McKeithen, with his credentials, North Louisiana, Protestant, Democrat, could be elected today?
I'm not sure a Democrat could be elected statewide. I think if a person had the right ideas, the right rapport with the people, that a North Louisianian who is a Protestant could be elected. But I'm not sure, Jim, that that person could be elected as a Democrat. It would have to be a very extraordinary circumstance in the political process, in the electoral process, for that to happen.
Why do you think that's happened in a generation?
Well, you look at the legislature. It's now a Republican legislature. Our statewide elected officials are all Republicans. The state has gone red in terms of philosophy, if not in terms of registration, although there are a lot more Republicans registered now than used to be. But clearly, the voting line is to the red part of the political spectrum rather than the blue part. And that's why I think under some extraordinary circumstances, a Democrat could win a statewide election. I'm just not sure those circumstances are going to present for this particular governor's race.
Jared Sanson?
It would be more difficult than it was then because of, one thing, the shift in population that we've had that's consistently shifted from North Louisiana to South Louisiana. So he would start with probably a weaker base than he would have had then. After all, I grew up in the 8th Congressional District that doesn't exist anymore because of some of our population shifts and losses. So I think that would be difficult. I don't know that I would underestimate him, though. And when you have somebody who's a master campaigner, they can overcome some very difficult obstacles.
Do you think any of the 4 candidates running today, the major ones, have the kind of charisma and magnetism that Governor McKeithen had?
I only wish they did. So, no, I don't. That's just a special quality. And either you have it or you don't, and I don't see it in this crop of candidates.
Ted Jones?
Well, I think that when McKeithen ran, everyone was registered as a Democrat in the state except a few people. There was very few registered Republicans. It was a closed primary system. And what changed the dynamics of the parties was the open primary bill that Edwin Edwards put in 1973. For the first time, if you wanted to register Republican, you could vote for the sheriff, or you could vote for the tax assessor or the clerk of court, people that had an effect on your life, the district attorney and things like that, and judges. So you could do it as a Republican or you could do it as a Democrat, but I don't think the parties, if people are going to let the party vote them, well, just send your proxy into Baton Rouge and let the Secretary of State count you up as a Republican or a Democrat and let it go at that. I think you need to vote for the man, doesn't have anything to do with what party he's in, because the party doesn't run his business. The party is just a label that he goes under because traditionally his family came out of that or didn't come out of that. That's what I think. I don't think it has anything to do with it.
Well, I do recall when Fox McKeithen, his son, switched his party affiliation to Republican, and I asked Governor McKeithen if he was going to follow his son. I got a rather vigorous no, and words beyond no. He believed there was a distinction.
Well, there is. People in the South forget that the Republicans sent the carpetbaggers down here, and in the Civil War they killed 2 of my great-grandfathers. I would never join the party, but it don't mean that I won't vote for a Republican. It doesn't have anything to do with the label he's under. But I'm not going to support the party myself.
Gus Weill?
I think it would depend on the candidates who he opposed or who opposed him. If they had the slightest little weakness, if they wore a wig, or their hair was cool, or they had a crew cut, Katie barred the door. When he got through all the stuff, there'd be nothing left of him. When I saw him and Shep Morrison on the first statewide debate on television in the WDSU studios in New Orleans, Morrison was a sophisticated man. He'd been the ambassador to the American state, the mayor of New Orleans. And I was standing in the back watching, and I almost fainted. Morrison said, "Commissioner McKeithen, come in." They were the candidates in the runoff. And McKeithen said, "What for?" He said, "I want you to pull my hair and prove once and for all that that's my hair." McKeithen said, "Oh no." He said, "Yes, you come here and pull my hair." And he was pulling his hair. I knew he was a beat man. McKeithen drove people crazy with that wicked tongue. We didn't fool with reality that much, I gotta tell you all. First of all, neither one of us knew much about it. We could shoot the breeze though. But I think that if he had run against candidates with certain flaws that his deadly eyes would pick out, he could be elected in Iran.
Now, make one more point about parties. That's one of the issues that Charlton Lyons addressed in his election with John McKeithen. You remember the "You can vote for Charlton Lyons" motto that he had? Yep. He had to convince Democrats that, you could in fact...
He was scared to death of Charlton Lyons.
Yeah, you could vote for a Republican.
Was a really outstanding candidate.
Yeah.
But McKeithen was so bright. So bright, my goodness. He thought ahead. Ted Jones was talking about how McKeithen beat him twice in a case. McKeithen's last case was in a parish adjoining Baton Rouge. It was a big accident case where some woman had gotten hit by a truck. And McKeithen went to represent her. And I know he didn't prepare. He never prepared. And he went. And when the case was over, I met him at the City Club. And I was nervous. I said, "How did it go?" He said, "I won." He said, "The other side didn't fight it." I said, "My gosh, what did you say?" He said, "Nothing." He said, "I appointed the judge."
Lawsuits. When his house burned down, he called me and asked me if I would represent Fox in a tax case. That Fox had all his stuff at John's house and it all burned, and Fox took a tax deduction for it. And I asked him, I said, "Governor, did you recover all your money and everything and from the fire and everything from the insurance company?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I just had to ask 3 questions." He said, "When they put the Westinghouse engineer on the stand, I asked him 3 things. I asked him his name and where he lived, and then I asked him if he knew Betty Furness." And when he said yes, he said, "I just broke him right there."
Nothing having to do with reality. But boy, he can weave those dreams, those spells. He can look in the eye with those green blue eyes and that reddish hair, and he was about 6'2", with big wood chopper's hands. He was a man. And he could charm a snake.
And he had a big foot too.
And a booming voice. That was the days of stumping. You better have a booming voice. Everything I learned at the foot of John McKeithen.
Now, Governor McKeithen took office May 12th, 1964, so that was less than 5 months after the assassination of President Kennedy. And he lived through, during his 2 terms in office, the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. There was strife across the country, riots in the streets, and we had some of that in Louisiana, but not as much as many other states, certainly not as much as neighboring states. Race was an issue then, as it is now, but particularly a hot-button issue in the late 60s and early 70s. Let's start with Gus and go down the line here. Gus, why was Louisiana able to be less of a powder keg than other places around the nation during his terms in office?
Yeah. Louisiana became a haven for the needy, for the poor. He was so generous of spirit. He loved people. If you came to his office and he had 20 appointments waiting, it didn't matter. He listened to you. Am I right, Nash? He listened to you. It was something else. When I saw him in his coffin, I said to myself, my God, my life is sort of ended too, because I needed to speak with him every day. We called each other. Never knew anything, never said anything, but we used to eat at the City Club in Baton Rouge, which he was a member of. I wasn't. And one day the manager came and asked me, he said, Mr. Weill, why don't you join the City Club? And John McKeithen said, why should this also be joined when I'm treating?
His membership was free. The City Club provided that to the governor, and that's why Gus wrote it.
Ted, your thoughts about why Louisiana was less of a hot zone in the late 60s than other states?
Well, I think it had to do with his leadership. Now, he didn't go and stand in the schoolhouse door like George Wallace. And he didn't get an axe handle and take out after people like Lester Maddox. And he didn't go into a group of 100 white people with one black man in there and say, which one of you gentlemen is Meredith, like Ross Barnett? John McKeithen went out and met with guys in leadership and had his people active in the communities. When they'd have a problem in a community, he'd send guys out there to calm that down and diffuse all of the problems that had come up that they couldn't. And when they had the big march with A.Z. Young from Bogalusa, he sent the state police out there to protect them people from what was going to happen to them. And he told A.Z., said, now look, the guns are loaded and the orders are shoot to kill. But the same guns that are loaded to hurt you will protect you, but you've got to obey the law. And that was his message to the black community. I'll protect you with everything I have, but I can't do it if you don't abide by the law. When you break out, then you're inviting disaster to roll in. And that's what
Ted, that day, I was up in the governor's mansion with him, and his phone never rang. The politicians were ducking him. They thought there was going to be blood, and they would be held responsible. I want to say something. Brian Boyles, who's of the Humanities and puts these symposiums on, he really needs to be congratulated, because I want to tell you why. I went and spoke at a university in North Louisiana several years ago, and they turned the whole student body out in the gymnasium. And I was to talk on the governors, Jimmy Davis, John McKeithen, Edwards. And I stood at the podium, and as I talked, I realized something that scared the heck out of me. None of them knew who I was talking about. Time goes that quickly. I changed my speech and talked about the weather.
Jerry, your thoughts about the 2 terms of relative calm in Louisiana
Yes.
amid a firestorm of action in other parts of the country?
Yes, and I don't want to underrate Governor McKeithen's contribution, because Bogalusa by itself could have blown up into a major confrontation, and it didn't, largely because of him. But Louisiana also had a heritage dating all the way back to Huey Long. Huey Long changed the tone of Louisiana politics. As we know, he promoted the idea that Louisiana government could help improve people's lives in Louisiana, but Huey Long didn't exclude black Louisianians from those benefits. So he began to create in Louisiana a class-based politics rather than a race-based politics, which Earl continued when he was governor for his terms. So I think it's a combination. Louisiana did have a racial heritage that was a little different from some of the other states, and then it had the right leader at the right time.
Professor Sanson,
Yes.
I want to tell you something that will add to your research. It really will,
Okay.
and which is not in any book. Towards the end of the time McKeithen was in office, we got a call that George Wallace wanted to see John McKeithen. And John McKeithen said, I can't leave, I got the legislature session. So George Wallace arrived, and McKeithen said, Gus, you sit in here in case that God says something that, and he said, Governor, I've been used up. Let me turn my organization over to you. He offered McKeithen his party. And McKeithen said, my heart wouldn't be in it. We don't have a similar philosophy. Did you know that? That he had tried to turn it over to
I'd heard that story,
That is true.
but I'm glad to have confirmation. Thank you.
Dan?
Well, I think early in Governor McKeithen's term, very early, in fact, in 1964, he was on the phone with President Johnson about integration order that had been issued for Santa Helena Parish. And if you listen to that conversation, you hear LBJ and Governor McKeithen talking about the type of protection that would be accorded. And he at that time committed the state police. He hired Jesse Stone as Ted mentioned. Who eventually became president of Southern University. He appointed Dutch Morial, an African American, to a judgeship down in New Orleans. The first African American in a judgeship. 2 of them.
Israel Augustine and Morial.
And so he actively sought to improve race relations. He had a lot of help from a guy named Victor Busey. Victor Busey was aligned with Governor McKeithen on racial harmony. And Governor McKeithen spoke to an AFL-CIO convention at one time and basically said, I'm not going to be leaving this state, and you're not going to be leaving this state, so it's time that we get together and make this state the best state that it can be. Something along those lines. And I think that was a key to organized labor. That was very strong in the state back then. And to Victor Busey, who was an extremely powerful political figure, as well as being president of the AFL-CIO. Once those things started aligning, I think both white Louisianians and African-American Louisianians trusted the leadership that was in Baton Rouge. And I think that helped diffuse some of the potential powder kegs that we might have had to deal with.
If any of you have questions, we certainly invite them. Please come to the podium, and we welcome your inquiries, observations, insights. So don't hesitate if you have questions for our panelists. And while we wait for those who would like to speak, it was 50 years ago today that Hurricane Betsy roared through Louisiana. And of course, Governor McKeithen was in office then. And that hurricane was as potent as Hurricane Katrina. The levees didn't break, but New Orleans flooded, and the rest of the state was affected dramatically. As far as his crisis management, how would you view that, Dan?
Well, I would point out that during the governor's 2 administrations, 3 major storms came ashore. Hurricane Hilda in 1964, Hurricane Betsy in 1965, and Hurricane Camille in 1969. He had to deal with a trilogy of very, very, very mad women storms, okay? And they really beat this state up bad. And I always had respect for the way he approached it. The president himself came down, and Ted and Gus will tell you this story. The president himself came down right after Betsy hit and spent time in New Orleans literally helping the response of the government to deal with people who were dying of thirst. Ted, you remember that? You were part of that.
Absolutely. And the first thing the president said, well, open up the soft drinks. All the water was contaminated. So they opened up the soft drinks, all the beer distributors and the soft drink distributors, they broke it out.
There was no bottled water back then, ladies and gentlemen. We didn't have that, you know.
Jared?
I was in the mansion the night that the late Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Hale Boggs, the congressman, big congressman, came to see McKeithen. And they danced around and hinted very strongly that if McKeithen backed Humphrey for the nomination, he'd probably be the vice presidential candidate.
I want to tell that story.
And we went to the convention, and it was a lie, just to get McKeithen's support. And in the middle of the convention, McKeithen turned to me and said, let's go home.
Listen, they did. Humphrey, in effect, offered McKeithen the job. But what he had to do to get it was go out and convince 28 people in the country, the major Democratic office holders and politicians, the head of the labor unions, Mayor Daley in Chicago, and Walter Reuther, and all the guys in Washington, that he could make a groundswell of support for the Democratic ticket. Well, when we were putting together the delegation, Humphrey told McKeithen, he said, listen, of your 36 votes, you're going to have 1/3 black. And so we sat down and figured out the 13 people that we wanted to put in the delegation. And Arthur Watson was chairman of the Democratic Committee, and Judge Perez was his lieutenant. And as a result of that, they would only approve 2 blacks. So I told Marshall Brown and Bob Hunter, I said, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to appoint the congressional delegation as delegates and take their resignations, because I know none of them are going except Russell and Hale, and Hale's going to be chairman of the platform committee, and Russell don't need a ticket. He'll have a ticket from the Senate. So that's what we did. I said, but I put a resolution through the Central Committee that said the governor could appoint and fill vacancies when the delegation left the state. Well, when we got to Washington and I turned in all them resignations from the congressional members, John appointed all the blacks. Well, let me tell you, Judge Perez and Arthur Watson came unglued. Man, they tore us apart. But McKeithen did his part. But he really, in the final analysis, told me and Marshall that he didn't want to be vice president. He said, it's not my kind of road.
He really couldn't be in anything that he didn't run.
Exactly.
They appointed him to the Board of Supervisors at LSU. I don't think he lasted 2 meetings. He quit.
I think
he wanted to run the show because he knew he could do it better than anyone else, and he could.
Okay, well, she has been waiting patiently. Hannah?
Hi, gentlemen. I'm Governor McKeithen's granddaughter, Hannah Springer. Nice to see you. I actually, Mr. Gus, have a question for you. I'm posing this from my brother, who is an Army Major, Russell Cummings III, who is training right now in Fort Hood and couldn't be here tonight. But he wanted me to pose this question to you, and I apologize for my voice. I am a school teacher here in Columbia, of which my granddaddy, I'm sure, would be proud. Long before Ferguson and Baltimore captured international attention, Louisiana's Bogalusa was a flashpoint in the civil rights movement and a defining moment in race relations in our state's history. It was also what military leaders call a decision point, a circumstance or event where a leader must make a hard choice that has lasting impacts. In light of the Ferguson and Katrina type events that we cannot predict, What lessons, Mr. Gus, do you think that our gubernatorial candidates from the leadership could learn from Governor McKeithen's leadership that he displayed? What kind of thing do you think they could?
First, he knew that black people were citizens just like white people. He also knew, this is a little detail, that if he did not protect those marches, the Justice Department under Bobby Kennedy were going to come down after him. So he had a little push there. So it was a combination of the reality of the situation and his belief that black people were entitled to be protected. If one black person had been hurt that day, though, I think that you would have had the federal government nationalize the National Guard, just as they did in Bobby Kennedy did in Alabama when Wallace stood in the door. Remember, they just come in and take over, and you do what they tell you. But those were the two reasons. I remember when John was so interested in that boy getting in the military.
We need you to go to the mic.
One other point about Governor McKeithen. We had a 27-month lockout in the plants along the Mississippi River that hurt the state pretty bad, and the governor worked hard to break that deadlock. It was labor and management standing off, fighting. And he went out and personally led the fight to break that thing. He called every business agent in the unions in Baton Rouge, all the managers of the plants, and he had what CEOs he could get. The last business agent that showed up for the meeting, the day he broke it, was Edward Grady Parton, and I was holding the door. And he walked up and he had two federal marshals with him. I didn't know they were federal marshals. I just thought they were business agents. And I said, look, y'all come on in, the governor's waiting for you. They said, well, no, we'll stay outside. I said, who are these people, Mr. Parton? He said, these are federal marshals. Well, he went in there, and let me tell you something, John McKeithen caught him in the collar and pulled him right up to him, and I mean, he laid a cussing on him. And that broke that deadlock. And let me tell you, he had guts. John McKeithen was
He wasn't afraid of anything, except y'all not liking him. He would have died if the people of Columbia didn't care for him. He loved you all so much. He loved Columbia.
He used to tell me, get your guitar, let's go to Jonesboro. We go to Columbia, and Doc's going to be up there, and he's going to bring the fiddle player, and we'll play some music.
Thank you, Jim. I really don't have a question, but I have sat there a long time as a Pentecostal preacher, first of all, and kept my mouth shut and listened to these wise men. I think we ought to give them a hand right now, don't you? And I am a Louisiana history buff. I have a little book here on Governor Sam Jones that I've written. I'm working on Speedy and Gillis Long, and I'm working on Otto Pastor. But I got to know Governor McKeithen toward the end of the road. Senator Kostelke, I got to know him when the cake was on top of all the rest of the food that had went down the drain, of life. And I have sat here and listened for Dan and for Jerry and for Dr. Jones and my friend Gus. I've been waiting for this, and here's the preacher in me, and here's John McKeithen. I brought my nephew up here before I moved to North Louisiana from South Louisiana. I brought my 8th grade nephew for an interview on the 10th day of April, 1995, so you'll know when it was. He was still in the best of his stage, Ms. Cummins, and still John McKeithen at his best. And I gave my nephew 10 questions. He didn't know anything about John McKeithen. He was born under Treen or somebody. And there I was, had been a teenager when Governor McKeithen went out of office. So I give him these 10 questions, and I'll be real quick. I respect Jim and their time. Now, one of them was, how did we get the New Orleans Saints? Governor McKeithen reared back and took a breath, Dan. He said, son, you're looking at the New Orleans Saints. He went with that.
Right.
The other question, there's 2 more questions, and I thought of them, and I said, ask him how did he push the people to be convinced to let him have 2 terms in a row. And he asked him that, how'd you get the law to succeed yourself? You want the truth? And I mumbled, I said, that's what we're here for, Governor. I was so good, that's why. And then the last thing I'll say on that, I told my nephew, I said, ask him where did he get that slogan? And I've listened for it, and they're a little older than I am. They've just forgotten about it tonight, and they can whip me after this. And he said, I had 1 minute on that TV ad. And said, the cameraman looked at me and said, say one more thing. He said, it hit me. Won't you help me?
The governor had an affinity for LSU football.
He went crazy over LSU football. Now that was something. He got me to go with him to practice one day. He said, Gus, get the call. He and I went there and we got to and Charlie McKeithen was the coach. And the governor and I was snooping on the ground, watching on our knees. And he said, Gus, come here. And I went to him and he said, hand me that twig. I did. And he drew up a play on the ground. He said, do you know what this is? I said, well, no, sir, I don't. He said, it's a football play. He said, don't you see it? It's the old Statue of Liberty. The quarterback gets the ball, drops it behind him, the halfback in. I said, what do you want me to do about it? He said, go tell Charlie McKeithen that I want them to try. I said, no, sir, I'll not do that. I ain't got the guts. And he never took me to another practice.
The governor played football at High Point, North Carolina College when he was in theological school. And one of his teammates was a guy named Terry Sanford from North Carolina, who later became governor of North Carolina, head of Duke University, and later United States Senator. And when he ran for president, Governor McKeithen had him down in New Orleans and raised him about $40,000.
Bob Meredith?
I got, of course, it's Uncle John to me. I've got 2 real quick stories that it's been touched on a little bit here, but I think I'll expand on it. One was, of course, you talk about the legacy of the Superdome. Of course, that was came about because of an amendment that passed to the state constitution in 1966, amendment number 10, if I remember right.
Number 10, that's right.
And it provided, I think, for $40 million in state financing, bond or something. When it began to have cost overruns. And so then it got challenged by things about Schepis, as I recall.
Mr. Schepis.
And so it goes working through the courts, and the constitutionality or the ability to build a Superdome, which they now couldn't build for $40 million, was hanging in the balance. If the state Supreme Court ruled against and said, no, the state can only finance $40 million, the Superdome would die. It would have never happened. All these things we've talked about would have never happened. Well, so he's really nervous about this. Uncle John is really nervous about this. And he told me this in a car ride coming back from Monroe, probably in the mid-'80s. And he said, I had some of the Supreme Court justices were there in the governor's mansion for some type of event. And he said, I'm sitting, and that vote is coming up, and he said, I just knew we were going to lose. He said, well, I've got to save the Superdome. And I'm trying to think, how can I appropriately go about encouraging them to vote the way I want them to vote? And he says, as they were walking out the door, he said, I grabbed the Chief Justice, and he says, whatever his name was, you guys may remember.
Judge Ayers.
Okay. And he says, Judge, he says, is there a retirement system for the judges of this state? And he said, well, no, Governor, there's not. He said, we're going to fix that next spring. And he told me, he said, Bob, you're the first person I've ever told about that. If not, he had convinced himself that if he had not had that conversation, that the vote would have been, he would have lost that vote, and the Superdome would have never been built. Mm-hmm. Second thing, real quick, talking about his oration skills. About in the early 1980s, he had me chauffeur him down to New Orleans, where he had been asked to be the guest speaker at the year-round Tiger Rooster Club. Everybody knows he's a big LSU football fan. And so it was in Kenner, out around the airport. So it's just the two of us. I drive him down there, and just so we get there, well, then of course, he is a celebrity. So everybody jumps in. Big John, Big John. He hadn't been out of governor's office this long time. So, I mean, he's just surrounded with people as they're walking down the hall, and I'm hanging back. So he goes up there for 10 or 15 minutes, and everybody's visiting with old friends, and all of a sudden he breaks out of the crowd. He comes back and he grabs me. There's probably 1,000 people there. He grabs me and he said, come on, go with me. I said, well, where are we going? He said, we're going to the bar. I said, okay. So we go to the bar, and we pull up to the bar, and he orders a double whiskey. I mean, downs it, just like that. And so I'm sitting there and watching him. He orders another one. Downs out. And then by the time he orders the third one, I said, Uncle John, what are you going to talk about tonight? He said, Bob, I have no idea. I'm waiting on the spirit to move.
Let me say this about the Superdome. He put the Superdome through the legislature with revenue bonds. And the proposal was it was supposed to cost $36 million. Now the reason I know that is this guy Cole from GSRI and I handled getting the bill together to put it through there. And I told him, I said, Governor, you can't finance a stadium like this with revenue bonds. He said, well, that's all I can get through the legislature. I can't get a general obligation bond through. So we went around and looked at stadiums, and the last stadium we looked at was Irving, Texas, Cowboys, Dallas Cowboys Stadium, and Clint Murchison had a party for us the night after we finished the tour. And he told the governor after the party settled down, we got in his study, and the real meeting got together. He said, Governor, look, he said, you can build a 55,000-foot stadium, and you can sell 50,000 season tickets and 5,000 general admission tickets, and you can make money. So on the way home, I asked him, I said, Governor, if I'm from Shreveport and I want to go to the football game and stay in the hotel and pay the hotel occupancy tax that we're putting on, why would I go down there when I can't get a ticket? He said, you know, that makes a lot of sense. Well, the next thing I knew, the stadium was 76,000 seats. That cost $100 million at change because there had never been a structure. Like
The whole thing came to $157 million.
No, it cost 193.
Oh, and not one penny was grabbed or stolen that they said he was going to do. First thing he did when he started the Superdome, he made a committee to oversee its construction. The deans of the architecture colleges of all of Louisiana's colleges and universities. You'll have time to tell one more story.
Well, in addition to that, let me say this, the revenue bonds wouldn't sell. So we talked about how to come up with a way to finance the stadium. So I told him one day, I said, Governor, you can lease an office building for the state, and you can sign the lease, and you don't have to go to the legislature to get that approved. Mm-hmm. He said, that might be the key to it. We got to looking at it, and so we called up Mr. Jack Stevens in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we talked to him about it. He said, Governor, them revenue bonds ain't any good. The governor said, well, suppose we put the full faith and credit behind the lease where the state would lease the stadium from the exposition district. He said, I'd take all them bonds, Governor, if you do that. And that's how we got this thing done. That's the way the stadium was financed. It cost $193 million, which included the scoreboard.
We were WJBO to make the final television spots, second primary, runoff. And McKeithen stood up against the wall, exhausted and financially busted. We had money to make one spot, so he made it. The director called me, he said, Gus, come here a minute, please. I said, yeah. He said, we got to do the spot over. I said, why? He said, Commissioner McKeithen is dropping the L in his speech. Wherever there's an L in a word, he drops it. So I looked over at McKeithen, exhausted, busted, emotionally spent. I said, no, let's go with it, heck with it. So it became, won't you help me? Not that big.
Jerry and Dan, as far as the legacy of the Superdome, how important is that when we review the 8 years of Governor McKeithen and what's happened to our state since?
You take it first.
Please,
Oh, well.
go ahead.
What do you see when you see a picture of the New Orleans skyline? You know, you see the Superdome. I think that says all of it, you know, that it became a symbol of New Orleans just as much as many other landmarks are what we think of with major cities across the country and around the world. It's that important.
Russell Long helped them with that dome. He got the railroad to sell all that property. They owned all the property where the dome is.
27 acres, that was 27.
Senator Benny Johnson fought the dome, in case you didn't know.
One of the things that dome did was bring together political dynasties to make it work. As Gus said, Senator Long worked hard to get that team to New Orleans to begin with, along with Hale Boggs. Governor McKeithen and Long drove along that expressway years ago and saw that property and decided that's where it needed to go. The railroads had it blocked in. Jimmy Fitzmaurice, who did not support Governor McKeithen because he supported De Lesseps Morrison, helped get the KCS to sell the property to the state.
The Illinois Central.
And I see, but he was working for KCS at the time. 2 railroads had to send, get a railroad to do something, it's tough. And Governor McKeithen pushed the dome through, and it was to Edwards' legacy to finish the dome and to dedicate it. And so what you brought together were the Hale Boggs clan, the Russell Long clan, the John McKeithen clan, the Jimmy Fitzmaurice political clan, and in the end, Edwards cutting the ribbon. Now it's an icon. How much better could you have with the Mercedes Superdome? An icon of the automobile industry, naming the icon of Louisiana sports and conventions and all the other things that are going to that city because of that Superdome and everything that's attached to it. Gus was right. John McKeithen saved New Orleans.
The dome should have not been named what it was named. It should have been named the John Julian McKeithen Dome.
Yeah.
Actually, it was at one time, and
I didn't know that.
yeah, and Tom Benson coaxed Powers to do other.
He had nothing to do with it.
Now remember,
I'm still angry. Half dead, I'm still angry.
I've heard all the stories about the Saints, but I want to tell you how we really got the Saints. Hale Boggs was the whip of the United States House of Representatives. Russell Long was the whip of the United States Senate and chairman of the Finance Committee. I got a call one day from Bob Hunter. He said, listen, Pete Rozelle is in town lobbying for an exemption from the antitrust statute so he can become the czar of football. And he said, he's got a meeting with Russell and Hale this coming week on Tuesday. Why don't you come up here? I said, well, let me go in and talk to the governor. So I go tell the governor. He said, well, get up there and find out what's going on. So when I get up there, they met with Hale Boggs. Dave Dixon was in the meeting, but Dave was doing tennis matches. He didn't come up with the Dome Stadium. He had the notion of getting a professional team, but that's all he really had. And so we go in and meet with Hale. Hale tells him, asked the commissioner, said, well, Commissioner, where's New Orleans in terms of getting a team? He said, well, you on the list and we're going to consider you when the deal is done and we expand the league, we'll consider New Orleans. We get over to Russell's office that afternoon at 2 o'clock, and Russ had been drinking a little bit. Bob Hunter and I told him, said, look, Russ, if you don't put your foot down, we're not going to get it. We go in the meeting, and Pete Rozelle tells Russell the same thing he told Hale. And Russell said, well, Commissioner, he said, I'm the majority whip of the United States Senate. Every piece of legislation that goes to the floor has to have my signature. He said, your issue is going to be on my list till we get a team. Do you understand that? And Pete Rozelle almost fainted. He said, what? And Russell told him again. Well, in that antitrust exemption piece that gave the NFL the ability to be the czar of football, there's a few words in there that I helped write that takes care of the New Orleans Saints. That's how we got the team, because Russell Long put it in there. And when that bill came to the floor of the Senate, Everett Dirksen from Illinois spoke for 2 hours and never said a thing about football. That's how we got it.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight and for remembering John Julian McKeithen, one of a kind and certainly a substantial Louisiana governor, and his legacy, even though he's been out of office for 43 years and he hasn't been with us at all for the last 16, he was with us tonight, and it's an honor to be here with so many friends and associates and to remember him appropriately.
Every man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all.